And now from the field of art, we move on to literature. But before we start, I would like to give you a small sample of poetry. In fields of gold where flowers sway, the bumblebee starts its ballet. A gentle hum, a whisper low, a dance of life where blossoms glow, and so on. How do you like this poem? Yeah, exactly. My point exactly. It's not a work of a genius. I wouldn't call it a masterpiece, but it's nice. It's okay. And I think that we can relatively easily reconstruct the person or the author behind those lines. I would say that it's rather a woman than a man, because that's the type of poetry we theoretically feel to be female. This lady is definitely not too young and probably quite old-fashioned, because this poem looks a little bit old-fashioned. It seems to me that it could have been written by William Wordsworth or Walter Landor or some other Victorian-era poet. What else? I think she's not a professional. I think she's just a kind-hearted amateur, famous mostly for her poems for family celebrations. I think she owes a cat, maybe two of them. And can you feel this warmth that all this image creates? I think knowing that there is such a wonderful, kind, elderly lady behind those lines, we probably would think a bit better about this poem that it actually deserves. But would our impression change should we know that there is no nice and good-hearted cat lady behind those rhymes? There is no living person at all. Of course, given that you know the topic, you should have been expecting something like that. I don't think that you're really surprised. But please imagine, what would you feel if you didn't know? I can speak for myself, and I need to admit that I would feel disappointed. I would feel confused. I would feel even maybe deceived. But why? The rhyme, the rhythm, it's all the same. It didn't change. Even the emotion in this poem created by a deep L neural network, when I asked it to create a poem about a bumblebee, it's still there. But something has changed. Why? Why does it happen? That is the question which we need to answer. And I think that it's crucial to this question to be answered as soon as possible. You may ask me why. Currently, humankind faces too many problems which seem much more depressing and much more serious. And there comes a lady telling you that understanding why are we feeling confused is that important. Let me give you a sample from my personal experience. Most of you who know me know that I'm a literary critic, but in fact, for over 15 years, I have been teaching academic writing. And 2 or 3 years ago, I started to notice that some students of mine, probably not the best ones, began to use AI for their essays. Of course, I felt very disappointed. But, which is much worse, I became much more skeptical, and it became difficult for me to trust any written piece that I get from my guys. That's really a problem. I don't trust the texts anymore. I don't feel sympathy to it. They don't touch me. And it's very difficult for me to evaluate them because I'm not sure whether they were written by a human person or by a neural network. I think that unless we answer the question above, that will be what we will feel about literature pretty soon. We will lose our touch, we will lose our connection with literature. We will be unable to trust it anymore, and thus we will lose our trust in human creativity in general, at least to human creativity with words. I think that losing literature would mean much more than just losing the pleasure it gives to us. That will mean losing a large part of our human nature, because literature is absolutely inherent for our culture. There is absolutely no civilization in the world that hasn't given us literature of this or that type. That's why I think we need to think on what we think about literature. There are too many things that we take for granted, but we shouldn't do that anymore. Now, when AI is dissolving borders between what we think about literature and what the literature actually becomes. Let's examine one more case. 1 year ago, Rie Quran, a Japanese writer thought to be one of the most prominent authors of her generation, was awarded a prestigious Akutagawa Prize, the most prestigious book award in Japan. And already on the stage, getting the bronze statuette from the hands of head of the jury, she confessed, or maybe just boasted, that 11% of her award-winning novel, Tokyo Tower of Compassion, in fact, was written by a neural network. That provoked huge scandal. Many people who have already bought her book wanted their money back. Many critics insisted that the prize should be revoked from her because that was unfair. But the judges, after hesitating for about a month, came back with their verdict, and the verdict was no. Their decision will remain unchanged. I think we wouldn't believe that they actually liked or approved Mrs. Kudan's way of action. They just didn't know how to deal with it. They didn't have any particular experience with that. They didn't have strong opinion. They didn't have a legal procedure for doing that for that reason. And that's exactly where we are. We don't know how to deal with that. It's very difficult to shape an attitude towards this event. We feel that something is wrong about it, but we can hardly tell what is so wrong. But this was about hybrid, award-winning intellectual literature. And now, from this place, let's dive into muddy waters of so-called indie writing. What is indie writing? We all know that in the world exist hundreds of thousands of people who want to write, but they cannot find publishers or literary agents for what they do. Beforehand, we would have called them pitiful graphomaniacs or unrecognized geniuses. It depends on point of view. But today we have another option. Those writers start publishing their books by themselves without having publisher on their side. And for that, they use various platforms, the most important of which is definitely Amazon Kindle Direct. And what's their business model? Every writer, every indie writer who wants to be successful needs to select a very specific, very narrow niche. For example, one of the most popular is the niche of young adult mermaid romantic fantasy. And those people who want to read about mermaids, they want to do it regularly. And the average period of expectation makes about from 6 to 9 weeks. If the writer does not provide a mermaid in time, the client would forget him, and the client would move on to a more reliable supplier who can provide mermaids in time. And that means that the indie author would lose its audience and will lose its money. That makes indie writing a kind of an arms race, because the writers need to write faster. And that makes them perfect clients for AI services. AI is currently unable to create a book by itself. It even cannot create a whole chapter. But there are lots of things that it already can provide. It can add descriptions. It can expand or shorten the text. It can even suggest some plot twists. And it definitely can recreate author's style perfectly. This all is that valuable that about 52% of indie writers currently admit using AI in their work. This type of writers prefer to call themselves assisted writers. That's a polite way to put that. If you meet an indie writer, please, you can be polite and ask him whether you're an assisted writer or not. Remember this useful term. What about recreating style? Let's have a look at it, how it works. You see, I gave to the neural network called Pseudowrite. Pseudowrite is a neural network targeted at indie writers, and it was created by 2 indie writers, by the way. And I gave it to it a very plain text, lacking any traces of individuality. And I asked it to recreate the same passage, but following Ernest Hemingway's style. And let's have a look what we get. Please pay attention to the word contain. The word contain, according to the analysis of the whole corpus of Hemingway's text, makes up to the top 10 words mostly used by the author. So it's very typical for Hemingway. And the words posh and dime are very typical for his epoch. And in the last sentence, have a look. Little did they know. This literary device is called inversion. And inversion is thought to be a trademark of Hemingway. All that means that it's really very, very valuable for the people who need to write faster and who need their writings to look like their other writings. So it really can help them. But even in this modest, undemanding, and single-use books, the readers are not very eager to support this. That's probably why the rest 48% of indie writers do not admit that, in fact, they're assisted writers as well. What do people say? The most popular claim is, why should I pay money to a person who cannot create a plot, describe his heroes, and so on and so on? Why should I pay to a person for the thing that I can create at home by myself? Of course, that's not true. There are very few people who can actually create a novel, whether either using AI or not. But it's understandable. I feel that it's understandable. I wouldn't pay for that, in fact. Being a lecturer and a literary critic, I've been asking the very same questions in very many audiences, starting from business schools and to freshmen at the university. The question is as follows: what book would you call perfect? And the answers vary, but not too much. Because usually people say that a perfect book should provide them with fresh experience, emotional and intellectual. It should provoke thought. It should feed and exceed our expectations. It should be well adjusted to what we currently need and want. Very, very few people, in fact, none, has ever mentioned that the author of the book should be an interesting and deep person. Of course, that is very important for a biography, but we don't expect a fiction writer to be that interesting. If we did, we wouldn't love Donna Tartt, for example, that much, because we know very little about her. So why are we so obsessed with author's figure? In the world exist very many writers we know very little about. We still cannot be sure that Shakespearean dramas were in fact written by Shakespeare. Many researchers still insist that their author is a playwright of 17th century Christopher Marlowe, well-known rival of Shakespeare. Or maybe they were written even by Queen Elizabeth I herself. And we definitely know that no person called Homerus has ever existed. His magnificent epic poems, Iliad and Odyssey, have been created by a number of generations of ancient Greek singers, so-called Aedi, who used to entertain ancient Greek kings at their feasts. Then why? What's the difference between not knowing exactly whether the author existed and knowing exactly that he or she didn't? To make it even worse, there is a funny statistics collected by Pew Research Center, God bless them. 32% of readers don't remember the names of the authors of the book they liked. It's very typical when a person comes to a bookstore and tells, I had such a wonderful book in a yellow color, can I get some more of that? And if we don't even remember the names, why? Why is the author that crucial to us? Why are we that reluctant to embrace an AI as an author, as a co-author? If you feel a bit confused on this point, you're not alone. I'm feeling confused as well, because I know that there is something within it, that I have this answer, but I cannot figure it out. So I think that's one of the most important things. We need to find the border of our tolerance for participation of AI in the process of writing. We need to understand that unless we come to a weird position where we expect every text, every literary text to be written by an AI. But the literature does not consist only of writers. Without readers, without being read, literature is dead. And the readers need to find out about new books from somewhere. Being a literary critic and thriving on analyzing, reviewing, and recommending literature, I'm glad to know that 61% of visitors of Goodreads site still say that they don't trust recommendations and reviews generated by AI. On the other hand, we currently know that from 20 to 45%, we didn't get exact figure and probably we will never get it, reviews at Amazon.com are in fact AI generated. They're only disguised to look like human generated. And very many people say that they find them very valuable, very relevant, and very helpful, which means that we don't rely on AI in supporting our reading patterns, but we use it and we rely on it. This is the thing that we definitely need to reflect on. Let's leave alone our poor AI for a while and find out how do people find out about new books in general. 64%, God bless them, still rely on the recommendations from the people they know personally, from their relatives and friends, or probably from me. 14% trust recommendations found on Goodreads and other platforms. You remember how many of those reviews are AI generated? But which is even more surprising, 21% of readers follow advices of bloggers and opinion leaders. Maybe you remember that some 10 years ago, Beckham family called their only daughter Harper. The legend was that while being pregnant, Victoria Beckham was reading a book, To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. And she loved this book that much, so that they decided to give the name of the author to their newborn daughter. But the book, written more than 60 years ago, immediately became a very large bestseller because the people knew about this book from the person they trusted. But in a few months, Victoria Beckham, in one of her interviews, mentioned that in fact she didn't read the book. She just liked the cover and the title. So what is the difference between trusting Victoria Beckham not reading a book and a well-trained neural network? It's a good question, and we need to reflect on that. If it goes like that, we can easily find ourselves in a position where artificial writers produce artificial literature, which is reviewed, recommended, and consumed by artificial readers. Of course, we're not yet there, but unless we answer the above-named questions, we can get there. So we need to answer those questions just to remind you about them. We still have some time. It wouldn't happen tomorrow. Not that in a couple of weeks we will find out that a new novel of Joanne Rowling or Donna Tartt or Stephen King were produced by an AI. Of course, that wouldn't happen that soon. Pessimists predict that it will happen in 15 years. Optimists give us more time. They say that it could happen in 30 years. But the day when an AI would write a novel by itself, and we will not only be unable to distinguish it from the human-generated novel, but we will find it impressive and maybe even great. Before we get to this point, we need to clarify our relationship with literature. If we want to keep literature as a significant part of our culture, which I believe we all do, and reflecting and giving those questions some thought and some effort is crucial right now. And if we're lucky enough and we manage to pass through this narrow and dangerous path, we will have a magnificent chance once in a lifetime to get the answer to the most important question concerning literature as such. We will get a chance to know whether is literature inherent for any type of thinking entity, and we will know whether a new type of intelligence, an artificial intelligence, would want to write a novel without being asked. I think that is worth waiting and worth thinking on the questions I gave you. Thank you so much.